Do we start? Or what we are doing?
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah. Good afternoon, colleagues and fellows. My name is Serges Kamga from the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. I'll be the moderator of this panel. And on my left immediately, is Mrs. Nomfundo, and at the far left, Mr. Richard Oates, who will be discussing with us this afternoon. We were asked to discuss the issue of migration. I would like to start by saying the migration it's a global phenomenon. When you look at the television every day, you see people going from country A to B by sea, by road, they use all means. And recently, we saw on television people from Bangladesh trying to settle in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they were kept at sea waiting. These are some migration issues. But again, a couple of weeks back in South Africa, there were migration issues that led to xenophobic attacks in the country. That's why, since we are having this meeting in South Africa, in this panel, we would like to focus mostly on the South African experience. And we are talking of migration. I will say I'm an African born in Cameroon and now in South Africa. So it's quite coincidental that we have to be discussing this topic, and I'm the moderator. So I would like to welcome you. The first questions that we'd like to address here, as I said, the focus will be in the situation of South Africa. And I would like the panelists to address us on few issues. Now, I will say the situation had been to some extent addressed. But the questions I would like them, and not to limit themselves to questions, they should be able to expand their thoughts and give examples from other places. But my first question will be to check what type of leaders do we need to address issue of xenophobic attacks. That's one. The second one will be how can we address xenophobic attacks without a systemic solution for inequality that characterize the country. And perhaps the third point will be what is the role of traditional leadership institutions in dealing with questions of migration. Without further delay, I will start immediately with you, Nomfundo. Thank you.
Hi, afternoon everyone. I'm Nomfundo Mogapi. I come from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. So the aim of our organization is to try and understand violence in South Africa, but also in our continent. So before I answer the specific questions, I think it's important to understand how we have been trying to analyze and make sense of this senseless violence that we've been seeing in our society recently. So when we talk about understanding the xenophobic violence, we usually say that there is a number of factors that have contributed to this xenophobic violence in South Africa. The first one, of course, is that there is a very strong culture or attitudes of xenophobia in South Africa. And we cannot run away from that, of prejudice. And I usually, when I talk to people, I said we should think about it more as the culture of othering rather than just only of xenophobia, because there is a very strong culture of othering, whether it's racial, whether it's ethnic, or whether it's someone that comes from outside. But for us to really understand the violence, we also have to understand what are some of the driving forces behind this violence. Because the tendency when the public discusses this violence is to only look at what we call triggering factors. Yes, it is true that when the situation is not stable, you do get what we call entrepreneurs, whether it's political or economic, who try to take advantage of the situation. And sometimes the tendency of leaders, since we're talking to leaders here, is that they tend to only listen to the political entrepreneurs, and their discussion is around the criminal elements, the people who are taking advantages, but without asking what is it that makes it so easy for the collectives and for the societies to be mobilized towards that violence. And for us as CSVR, we're really pushing that we have to understand the deeper issues, which are usually not clear-cut and requires more long-term intervention from the leaders. So some of the issues that we know are relevant in South Africa, but I think also having engaged with other people in the continent seem to also be emerging in the continent, is that most of these communities would say to us they would have tried over a period of years to raise some of these issues in a peaceful ways with the leaders. However, they will find that the leaders haven't really heard or responded appropriately to some of their needs. So the growing socio-economic exclusions of the majority of the people in South Africa is actually feeding to some of this violence. And the number of people feeling that their cries and their concerns are almost falling into the deaf ears of the leaders. The other issue that I also usually talk about, which I think is even relevant in our continent, is what I call the unresolved issues of our past. As a country, we are still dealing with our violent history and what I call our woundedness as a society, where a majority of people were dehumanized, were brutalized because of their skin color. And we really haven't, as a society, fully dealt with that woundedness. So there is a woundedness at the level of people who felt marginalized, but also the other concept that I'm starting to talk about is what I call the woundedness of leaders, which I think would also be relevant for you as young leaders of our continent. What happens is that most of the people who end up leading our countries after conflict or after struggles are people themselves who have been affected by the struggles. And when you are wounded as a leader, your woundedness determines what you are able to listen to or not listen to. So you find that most of the leaders, they are so identified with having fought for the struggle, having fought for the freedom, that any information that says you are actually not fulfilling what you wanted to do, or sometimes your institutions are perpetuating the very same ills that you were trying to address, come into deaf ears. So wounded leaders only listen based on their woundedness. And that's what we've been finding, that our leaders, when they listen to these issues, they'll tell you they only more listen to the criminal elements and the opportunists, but not the genuine concerns on the people on the ground. So a combination of all these things, a group of people who are increasingly feeling marginalized and excluded, who, for them, the continued social exclusion triggers again the dehumanization that they have experienced, together with the leaders who are not listening, create a rife ground for young people who are almost combat ready. A small thing like an utterance from a leader can mobilize them to the kind of violence that we are actually seeing in South Africa, and some of the brutality which actually reminds us of our past. So I think it's really important to understand that. But I think the other issue that we need to understand, and we must be questioning ourselves, is what is it that is bringing so many people to come to South Africa? And to really look as leaders how we can begin to strengthen the rest of Africa, because issues of political and instability in Africa contribute to the number of people coming to South Africa looking for opportunities. So I think all these issues are issues that we really have to look at. And for me, you ask a question on what is it that we can begin to do as the emerging leaders. And for me, what I would really like to push is that in countries like South Africa and Africa that have got such history of woundedness that we have not dealt with, it's no longer a luxury for leaders to improve their own emotional intelligence. Being a leader is not just about you knowing the content of the work that you do, it's about you also being able to deal with yourself. Because I've seen many leaders sabotaging the very same things that they are trying to achieve because they haven't worked on themselves. So the best gift that you can give our country and our continent is to also invest in your own healing, because you are able to hear differently. You are able to even listen to the uncomfortable thing, because Africa is looking for leaders who can engage with the uncomfortable conversations that we need to have as a continent. But leaders who haven't dealt with themselves, they only listen to what they feel comfortable with. And when you do that, the masses will get agitated, the people you lead will get agitated, and you will be surprised why sometimes they react violently as you would think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. I also want to thank Nomfundo for the very valuable contribution. Many of the things that I was planning to say, unfortunately, have already been said. But I'll try to put a different spotlight on the issue. The questions you asked, how do we address xenophobia, and what type of leaders do we need in order to do this? Let me start with those two questions. I think what is very important as a leader is to be able to take a step back and not being drawn in by the emotions of the crowd to take a reactive approach, but rather take a step back and properly analyze, look at the issue and see, is this really what we're dealing with? In the case of xenophobia, and as you've mentioned, all the violence against migrants that we've seen, is it really all xenophobia? If you define the problem as xenophobic, then it also shapes the response that you'll take in addressing the issue. And I think it's important to take a step back, look at the violence that we've seen on a factual basis, without labeling anything. Say, we have experienced violence against migrants, what are the root causes? Make a proper analysis. And then you'll see that to a certain extent, yes, it may be xenophobia. There may be a resentment against foreigners in the country. There may be a feeling that there's too many migrants, that they're migrants with the wrong profile, and that they're engaged in activities that we don't want them to do in the country. But is that a full picture? And I think that's a very important question to ask. I think if we properly look at what actually happened, I think we have to come to the conclusion that the phenomenon is a bit more complex than that. It is not just xenophobia. There's an element of opportunism. There's an element of people taking advantage of the breakdown of the rule of law in order to quickly enrich themselves with impunity. Why is that the case? How come people feel that they can do so? There may be some prejudices that need to be addressed in order to correct that feeling that people can act against migrants. Is there something in the profile of the migrants that needs to be addressed? We've seen, for example, particularly with Somali business people, that they tend to distrust banking systems and therefore are more inclined to keep large sums of money in their shops. That makes them a more attractive and a more interesting target for looters. They're also the soft target. Migrants tend to be soft targets because they're relatively anonymous. They may not be registered. They may not be part of a broader social network within the community. Law enforcement agencies may not be inclined to respond as quickly to attacks on foreigners as they may be as attacks on South Africans. So there's a host of factors that comes into play. And then there's another explanation that I think plays a role, and that is the scapegoatism. The violence that we see against the migrants, to what extent is that really directed against the migrants? And to what extent is that a message to the government? We are unhappy We are unhappy with the lack of service delivery. We are unhappy with the level of unemployment. We are unhappy not having proper schools, not having an education system that gives our children the kind of future that we want for them. So to what extent is violence against migrants as soft targets a message to the government? Is it directed towards the government rather than against the migrants? And I think this is more than an academic exercise. We're not just going through the motions of coming up with a nice policy paper on what are the root causes of migration. But as I mentioned, a proper understanding of the root causes of this violence helps shape the policy decisions that you take in order to address this. We've discussed this with the government, and some people within the government may be inclined to take a very reactive approach, which I think is proper. You need to stabilize the situation. You need to arrest the perpetrators. You need to bring them to justice. You need to assist and protect the victims of the violence. But it doesn't stop there. There's more that we have to do. If we just stabilize the situation and bring the perpetrators to justice, we haven't done anything to address the underlying situation. And if the underlying situation is the presence of migrants in the country, if that indeed is the root cause, then we'll have to look at how do we address this. Are there too many migrants in the country? Are the migrants with the wrong profile in the country? And it's something that we need to develop a consensus within society, to what extent that is the case. And how do you manage that? If the immediate response would be, we have to close our borders, we have to erect more walls, more barbed wire, deploy the army along the borders, is that going to work? Is that an approach that we feel is going to be effective? I was in Messina just 2 weeks ago, and I drove along the border. It's a very impressive setup. The border with Mozambique, with Zimbabwe, between Zimbabwe and South Africa. There's 3 lines of barbed wire. It's high. It's quite impressive. I drove along the border for about, I think, 30 kilometers. Every 100 meters, it is breached. So you have this impressive setup, but all you need is a wire cutter to breach it and go through. Border management ultimately is necessary, but will not be sufficient. What is sufficient, what will be required from the side of the government, is to come up with an active policy to manage migration. That does not mean keep the migrants out. That means get a better understanding and a better administrative grip over who is in the country. And for this, the government does need to step back, and the leaders need to step back, and the leaders need to look at the root of the problem and how to address it. Labor migration, in our opinion, is an important part of the solution. You can't simply try to close your borders and keep the migrants out. Rather, you offer a legal alternative to irregular migration. If you offer people a legal alternative, 9 times out of 10 people will prefer to be legal rather than undocumented. So you offer that as a proper alternative, as a legal alternative to irregular migration. There's a lot of advantages to this approach. It gives the government a better approach, a better grip, a better administrative grip over who is in the country, who comes into the country. It also gives the country the ability to promote the circularity of migration. So it's something that I think as an approach to migration management or the violence against migrants would be a very constructive and productive one. Additionally, the migration process, I mean, we all know migration is as old as mankind. If it weren't for migration, we'd all be living in one corner, be it West Africa, be it South Africa, East Africa. We're living in a small corner of Africa. Migration has brought mankind where it is. We have to recognize that migration is not necessarily a problem. Migration, in many cases, is part of the solution. For a lot of people, a lot of families, migration is the way they address the problems that they have, be it political instability, be it economic hardship, natural disasters, etc., etc. So for a lot of people, migration is actually the solution to a problem rather than the problem itself. And I think this is also something that leaders need to recognize, that on an individual level, migration can be a solution to problems, but also on the country level, it can help solve problems. For example, in shortages on the labor market that cannot be filled domestically, could be filled through a circular labor migration scheme with neighboring countries. So, in brief, take a step back, look at the issue, analyze it properly, and try to stick to the facts rather than the emotions of the man in the street.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. My next question will be, because you brought in very, very good issues. You have migration laws, you have various laws in South Africa. We have I will say, a very good constitution. But when it comes to migration and people want to attack or to be xenophobic, they don't care about the laws, the criminal system, the court system. And in this democracy, we have to deal with the reality of traditional leadership as well. Now, how do we tap into that aspect of the local reality to respond to migration issues? This question comes from the fact that perhaps the king, the Zulu king was misinterpreted or misquoted, as he said, but his statement may have fueled some xenophobic attacks. And whether we like it or not, we have that system of traditional leadership. We can't now revert back in this democracy. Now, how do we use that system of traditional leadership or indigenous system to build an inclusive society? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's really important when we try to analyze this situation of xenophobic attacks to understand it from knowing what we're dealing with. And what we've been saying is, when you're trying to analyze a violence like this, you need to look at, okay, so what are the perpetuating factors, right? So the factors that perpetuate and fuel the fire of the violence. What are the precipitating factors, so the things that trigger the violence? And then what are the root causes? Because I think we've really been concerned as to how the public discussion has been, the direction towards in which it's being steered to. Because the utterances of the king or of the leaders, we really see those as triggers or precipitating factors. And what it's important to analyze them, they cannot be our focus of attention, because then we focus our energy on the wrong things. And I think for the haves in our society, what is uncomfortable to engage with is the root causes, because the root causes force us to look into ourselves and saying, what is it about us that continues to fuel this inequality? Why is it that I can stay in Sandton with my high wall $1 million house, and in Alexandra there's a family that doesn't eat for 3 days, and I still feel comfortable behind those walls? What is it about me with my big car that makes me, when I walk in the street, to look at another human being asking for money as if they are subhuman? And I think those are the questions that we should be asking ourselves. What is it about us as a society that produces such angry young people? Because we've got a group of angry young people. So the question is to look into ourselves. For me, the issues of traditional leadership and kings give them power because we've got agitated young people. We have to address these 3 ills in our society: inequality, poverty, joblessness. And we have to look at our unresolved collective trauma and begin to deal with our woundedness. Then when we do that, the leaders will lose power. People will be able to say, well, let's sit back and think about this. So people are looking for every avenue that is available. Next time it won't be the traditional leader, it will be any other person who can mobilize people easily. And for us, this really concerns us, because if we don't address these root causes, we're beginning to radicalize our young people. Now, it's easy for young people to be radicalized when they are angry and they are hungry. And this is a relevant question for Africa with all the challenges we have around terrorism and all of those issues. So I think to to answer your question, I think the question of leadership, yes, is important, but let's see them as precipitating factors. Next time it's not going to be him, it's going to be someone else. So maybe we are asking the wrong question. And if we ask the wrong questions, then we're not really addressing some of the situations. So I know I haven't answered your question, but I'm posing even more difficult questions for us.
After hearing from Richard, I will perhaps reclarify or recalibrate the question because I think that when we have a system, I'm not trying to castigate the traditional leadership system. I'm actually trying to say, if we, I will say, because we have two legal systems in the country. You have the customary system, that is an indigenous system where people are also responsive to. And if we address the issue of inequality using the indigenous system as well, it will boil down and have more effect. I am saying, at some point, if the modern system or the executive seems to be lacking more authority in front of the indigenous knowledge system, we should be able to tap into that notion of Ubuntu, for instance, to tap into it and see how we can build an inclusive society. And this had happened in South Africa when we were talking of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people from all races decided to come together and address their issues. I'm trying to look at how, besides looking at the normal modern system, we can actually use the indigenous system as an addition. It's not either or. Kind of getting, because actually the king said, no, that's not what I've said. And if I have said so, the country was going to be in ashes. Very good. Now, people are coming. We can tap into that system whereby people will respect their culture more than what they see as imported culture. That's what I was thinking. We could add some value in dealing with migration by looking at indigenous aspects. That's what aspect I wanted us to interrogate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I fully agree. There is an element of friction between modern governance and traditional leadership, and I think it's good to look at the positive sides of both and try to see how we can use the potential of both systems to address this issue and to prevent the friction between the host communities and the migrant communities. And the potential is absolutely there. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen to a certain extent is that people feel alienated from society, from their communities. People don't feel part of the communities. And there's a number of people that try to ride on that try to take advantage of that and build communities through exclusion rather than through inclusion. You see leaders emphasize or overemphasize a number of elements from within society at the exclusion of others, and it's in many cases a very artificial exclusion. But the question is, if this is the policy that you pursue, if this is the road you want to walk, by building a community through exclusion, then you've got to ask your question: where does it stop? When does the fragmentation that you're pursuing come to an end? And it's something that, as a policy, I think will ultimately come back to bite the community leaders in the delicate parts, if you will. So it's not something that as a policy we think is very productive. We encourage leaders to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and this goes for traditional leaders as well as the more modern governance structures. Embrace migrants for the positive contributions that they bring, and recognize that migration has a role to play in society, and a very constructive and productive role to play. And by excluding them, you not only hurt the migrants, but ultimately you hurt society itself, and you heard the very fabric on which societies are built.
Yeah, I mean, and just to say that with my response, it was, of course, responding partly to your question, but it's been responding to the public discourse that has been existing, I think, in South Africa, but we also see this in our continent, where when problems like this come, we tend to use what we call the moral panic. We respond out of panic, and we try to identify the problems rather than looking into ourselves. So I am deliberately making us feel uncomfortable as the haves in our society, because I think the solutions lie with us, and when we ask these difficult questions. But I think we should also be careful around either, romanticizing or even demonizing the traditional leadership. I think your question really speaks into the vacuum of leadership in South Africa and in Africa, because increasingly communities and young people are feeling that they can no longer trust the legitimate leaders as the leaders. And maybe the situation now is, where do we look for leadership? Maybe we need an alternative leadership that needs to emerge, not looking at the traditional government or traditional leadership, but really being creative. I mean, for example, recently we've seen an emerging leadership in organizations like UCT, where young people literally decided to stand up and fight for issues of transformation, and they were able to engage in a dialogue about very uncomfortable issues. I mean, needless to say that the entrepreneurs then took it further in other places. But we're beginning to see that maybe young people who are able to articulate these issues and make us hold dialogue about difficult things can begin to make us to shift. Even with the xenophobic violence, we've also been talking about the role of bystanders. Yeah? That sometimes even the adults and the mothers who see this violence and just sit and do nothing could also emerge as alternative leaders. So the question is, how do we begin to fill this vacuum of leadership that is existing in our society, where the traditional, we still have to hold government accountable, please, I mean, that's really important. And the traditional leaders have to be responsible, but we can no longer just only rely on them to assist us in taking our society forward.
Yeah, very good point. Yes, and the other aspect I would like us to discuss, Richard, is to some extent examine the role of civil society organization and churches in dealing with violence against foreigners. What will be your take on that?
Now, the response that we've seen after the recent events, particularly in Durban, from civil society, I think has been very positive. But again, it's been by and large reactive. And of course, when you're dealing with an immediate crisis, you need to be reactive. You need to make sure, as I mentioned, that you help stabilize the situation, protect the victims, etc. And we've really seen civil society rise up and be very effective and efficient in dealing with the emerging crisis. The government, I think, all in all, has done ultimately a good job in responding to the violence, but certainly civil society has played an extremely important role in dealing with this as well. But then the next step, of course, is how do you make sure that this doesn't happen again? And the immediate focus is to go to the places where it's happened. So there's a lot of attention from civil society to go to Durban and to set up programs for social cohesion and peaceful cohabitation and mutual understanding and appreciation. But the question is, why Durban? The mere fact that it has happened in Durban does not mean that next time it will happen in Durban again. And rather than looking at the location where things have gone wrong, maybe we should go to the locations where it hasn't gone wrong, and see if there's a key difference in how communities live together in other areas. And if there isn't, then maybe we should take preventive action and make sure that what we've seen in Durban in the past, that it doesn't happen in those communities. I mentioned that in my trip to a number of border management areas, and I spoke with the officials, and I asked them, do you think something like happened in Durban could happen in Musina, so on the border with Zimbabwe? And they said it's absolutely impossible. It will not happen. And the key difference is that the economy in many of these border towns relies so strongly on foreign trade, so strongly on people coming in to do the shopping, that if xenophobic attacks or violence against migrants were to happen, it would severely hurt the economy of those cities. And I think this is something that teaches us a lesson, that in many cases, the realizing the interdependence that we have as communities, or that we have as a host community with migrant communities, that kind of interdependence helps stabilize the situation and helps prevent violence from flaring up to begin with. And I think it's particularly civil society organizations that have an excellent role, an excellent potential in making people realize to what extent they depend on each other, and to what extent the value that migrants bring, or the people from other communities bring to their society, is to the benefit of everybody. It's a holistic mechanism that benefits the host community as well as the migrant community, in many cases the communities of origin of the migrants.
Yeah, I think, when you look at civil society, you can have the sort of the narrow definition of civil society representing like organizations like ourselves, who are more formal, or you could have a broader definition of like the role of non-state actors in dealing with this stuff. And I really like the broader definition of the role of non-state actors, because it begins to shift us away from looking at government as, the main player in dealing with the social ills of our society, because we really have to mobilize all non-state actors. And with that broader definition, I think there's two levels for me. I agree that we have really seen quite a lot of civil society organizations, churches coming up and responding through food, through other issues. But what we've also seen is that the tendency of civil society, including ourselves, is again responding through this moral panic. That when there's an emergency, we respond in a panic, we help, then the things go down, and then we sit as if the problem is gone. And for us, the question has been, how do we really create sustainable and durable responses to these issues, even after they've gone? Because the issue of xenophobic violence is not something new. We did a research in 2003 as CSVR, identifying xenophobic violence as one of the fault lines for our democracy, but nothing was done. We responded in 2008, and there was a panic. We were also responding to that, and then we sit again. So how do we really create a durable response to these issues? The other question for me is that I find that, civil society, it's easy for us to respond when there's a clear victim, right? Like, the migrant, the children, the women. But when we have to start getting into this uncomfortable territory of these people who are neither victims of perpetrators, of engaging, I will go back again because I want to drill this, of dealing with inequality and all of that stuff, we really struggle with those issues. So I think there's a bigger question on how we engage with the longer term issues. If we look at civil society only in terms of NGOs, we do run into trouble because we tend to be project driven, and donors fund things that are sexy, so it becomes difficult to sustain some of these issues. But if we look at the larger non-government institutions, then we are able to mobilize ourselves a bit more as a society, and saying it will take all of us in South Africa to create the kind of South Africa that we want. We're not just only going to rely on government or formal organizations.
Thank you very much, Nomfundo. Thank you. At this point, I would like to open it up to the audience for question, comment. Please, you keep straight to the point to give a chance to as many as possible to contribute. We'll take, in terms of, let's say, a series of 4 questions or comments. Please, straight to the point. I see the first one, second, third. Yeah, we take the first 3 and the 4th behind.
Hello, thank you very much. Firstly, it's really informative. Thank you to the panel. It's a very interesting debate that we're having here. I, however, want to disagree with a couple of things and bring up something. But it's important to highlight firstly, and something that I haven't heard throughout the debate so far, is the cheap labor element at the center of South Africa's xenophobic violence, be it 2003, be it the most recent ones about 2 months ago. At the thread of all of that, when you speak to people on the ground or grassroots people, I really hate that term, you'll find that there's an element of cheap scab labor that's used, and that's a sense of exploitation. It's a sense of exploitation, firstly, so you have two exploited groups of people fighting each other for the scraps that they need to survive generally. So let's say South African farmers will hire migrant labor for way less than the minimum wage, although we're still struggling with the minimum wage for South African citizens, for way less, because it's a vulnerable people, and it's a people that's easily exploitable. I think that's a discussion that ought to be had, and it's a discussion that we need to ask ourselves, how do we protect both South Africans and migrant laborers from exploitation in general? Because I think we in trying to sort of analyze societal structures and trying to analyze why we're violent people, we forget the role of capital in this. We forget the role of systems that exploit people outside of that space. I think that's the first thing. I think my second point, and which is also my last point, is the fact that maybe, just maybe, this needs to have us start thinking about a borderless continent. I think we're at a stage where we need to think about our continent as a continent we're one. I for one think that it's sad where we have 3 layers of barbed wires between ourselves and Zimbabweans, or any other country, in fact, on this continent. I think it's sad that diplomatic relations have deteriorated in such a way that I need to pay 7,000 rand to get a visa in Nigeria currently. I think it's sad for the continent, but it also doesn't speak to us crafting a sort of one singular vision. So I think we need to speak to the question of exploitation and the exploitation of vulnerable people, but also explore the concept of a borderless continent, because the borders were not ours. They were written up in Berlin. So it's something that we need to speak about. Thank you.
Marlon, and I am from Zimbabwe, and I can hear myself. Wow. Firstly, I would say we are one. We might not have managed to print enough t-shirts for all of us, but from the interaction that we have had with each other, I do believe that on our hearts, the words are written, we are one. And now, I think from just listening to you, there's been too much focus on xenophobic violence. It seems as if we are saying xenophobia is normal, but the xenophobic violence is what's bad. It's not only about the violence. Xenophobia itself is wrong. That sentiment of fear or hatred for a foreigner is wrong. And also, I do understand that inequality issues are the root, but there is xenophobia in the boardrooms. I think it's Trevor, the head, the owner of the Mail and Guardian, who talked about his experiences of being segregated in the boardroom as a foreigner. So how can we really address xenophobia as a sentiment, not just the violence, but xenophobia itself? Thank you.
Thanks. Next.
Good afternoon, South Africa. Good afternoon, Africa. A lot of South Africans are actually happy to see me because during the xenophobic period, during the violence, I came out strong together with my colleague Isaac seated over here. We strongly condemned the violence, and we even went as far as bringing it up with IREX, and we started pushing for the change of venue because of this conference to another conference, to another place, maybe safer place in Africa. So we went to that extent. The reason why we were that bitter is we feel South Africa needs to change. The times have changed, and South Africans need to change as well. They can no longer live the way they used to live under apartheid. We live in a global economy, and we're interdependent on each other. Zambians and just like other Africans, do business from Durban, which is one of our largest ports, up to as far as Cairo. So South Africans need to change. As leaders, what they should actually really focus on is the rule of law. I feel South Africans and their constitution is weak, and it doesn't protect the migrant. It doesn't protect not only its own citizen, but also the foreigners. And the enforcement of those laws have to be there. Because some of those gruesome pictures we saw, even on the internet, you see somebody burning here, and the policeman is laughing here. In Zambia, that can't happen. You can't even point at a foreigner in the wrong way. The law will visit you. In the US, you can't point or slap a foreigner. The law will be there. So South Africa needs to improve its constitution, needs to improve its rule of law. Thank you.
Yes, the last one.
Hear me?
Yes, we can
Yeah,
hear you.
my name is George Tsibani. I'm from Lead Africa. I think you have touched a number of areas that I think I agree with, the triggering factors. And I agree with you, my lady, that you missed the First Lady yesterday as well from Namibia. He mentioned a number of issues around what you called discomforting factors, which I agree entirely with you. But the question that you have raised also is about how we lack humanity and the issue of Ubuntu, particularly from universities. We have to deal with the issues of decolonizing knowledge, which is back to what you are saying, indigenous knowledge, and how the role of traditional leaders can play in that. I've done a lot of work around that. The unfortunate part is that you have universities that are competing to each other with the wrong curriculum from West Africa, from West, and not even on Middle East, where we have South-South sort of comparative analysis. And the second area is universities are letting us down on two issues. Firstly, there's no intra-Africa programs. We have a UNISA program, we have Stellenbosch program. There's no interaction between the university. The curriculum design is designed to talk about the case studies of New York and somewhere in an island, you know. And I don't understand why are you not decolonizing knowledge? Because you are supposed to lead this country as intellectuals, as the 19th century African intellectuals have done. I'm not sure where we are with African intellectuals. And then the last area is that when it comes to traditional leaders, we must talk about infrastructure because of universities that we are having in South Africa, we are producing Eurocentric planning programs. Eurocentric planning programs that are very objective and technical sound, but very lacking a lot in terms of what I call aesthetic relational values, which is subjective. I belong to this community, I belong and I'm a member of this community. That's what is lacking. And as a result, we cannot appeal to an ordinary youth in this country. You also cannot appeal to an elder in this country, except you can howl and make rhetorics like the current politicians are doing, both from north and south, from east and west of Africa. So it's not a South African case only. It's Africa's case that we need to look at. So my view is that if you look at the programs that we have, they are urban programs. That's why you talk about in South Africa, RDP houses, because you must go to an informal settlement, a hazardous environment for you to get an RDP. You live a rural development. We don't have rural development. There's no integration between rural development and urban development. We only produce cities that are decolonizing themselves and so on. So my view is that we should go back to basics. Indigenous knowledge and infrastructure and aesthetic relational values. The word aesthetic is more important because we talk about beauty of our country and beauty of our country and nations. And we're not talking about tribes, we must talk about clans because clans have no boundaries. but trials have boundaries that have been sort of conceptualized in Berlin. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We first allow the panelists to respond to your comments and questions before we take a second round. Thank you. You can start, please.
Thank you for this stimulating and challenging inputs. And I really see this as a dialogue. So with people down there who are also even experts in other areas. So I will not respond to all the questions. But what I just wanted to respond to is the first speaker. I think what you are talking about as the issue of cheap labor is really important, because at the core of this problem for survival and livelihood, that is what is happening. And it's around access to resources. And I agree with you, we haven't problematized enough the problem, the issue of capital and business in some of these problems that we actually have. Because there are these, what we call economic entrepreneurs who take advantage of the situation and exploit people, and therefore contribute in creating this rife environment that makes our people to be angry. So we really do have to start, because we've done a lot of work in South Africa in problematizing government. We know where their mistakes are. And business South Africa and capital South Africa is just sitting there comfortable, and they also play a role. It's very uncomfortable because they are the people who hold the money, but there's a lot of questioning around what is their role in perpetuating some of these issues. The idea of a borderless continent is really appealing, and I think as young people, that's what you should be looking towards. But before we deal with the borderless South Africa, we have to deal with the internalized borders that we've created and made them our reality. Because you see, the power of colonialism and apartheid is that it wasn't just a political and an economic system, it was a psychological system which was created to make a black man hate himself, so that even after the laws are out, we still continue to other and hate each other. So we need to have that hard look into ourselves and deal with that. Otherwise, if we just remove the borders without having dealt with ourselves, we're going to end up harming ourselves actually as a society. And I think the comment, I really liked it, because one of the things that I've been saying is it's been interesting to hear some of the utterances of our leaders when they condemn xenophobic violence. Because you will hear them that they condemn the xenophobic violence and not the xenophobia. There will be some of our leaders who would even say, yes, we know they are taking your women and children. However, it doesn't justify that you should kill them. So there's really, and there's been this sense that we're not xenophobic as South Africa. I mean, from the work that we've done, we know that we hold very xenophobic attitude. Most of us won't act them out, but you should just listen to some of the utterances that we hear from our leaders. And until we face that truth, we're not going to be able to deal with this problem. So I think I agree with that. I think finally, the issue of the rule of law, I agree 100%. We need to strengthen the rule of law in South Africa. It is important. It needs to work. We have to look at protecting not just non-nationals, but also even locals. Our stats show that there's been over 2 million incidents of crime in South Africa. And most South Africans feel unprotected, so we need to create a balance. However, and I need to face this, to emphasize this, it is so easy for us to say, just to have the rule of law, these are criminals, put them out there. Work in relation to criminal elements shows that in any society, only about 3 to 4% people deserve to be put into prison. The rest is about the type of a society that you are having that fits into the criminal element. So we have to not just only look at the rule of law, which is comfortable for the haves, to say just have the rule of law. We have to also deal with the social ills in our society that fits into people feeling uncomfortable.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'll keep it brief, not to repeat too many things. On the first question, exploitation of foreign labor. Absolutely, it happens a lot. I don't want to generalize and say that it's in the majority of the cases, but certainly farmers along the borders may be more inclined to exploit foreign laborers than domestic labor. what do we do about it? How do we deal with that? I think I've hinted at that in my initial address. Circular labor migration agreements that South Africa has traditionally had with neighboring countries, but that have by and large expired. And even the way it has been implemented, I think left some efficiency questions open. There's a number of international best practices on circular labor migration agreements that are quite positive, quite constructive, and I think South Africa would do well to learn from some of the best practices in order to have the country of destination, South Africa in this case, the country of origin, the sending communities, and the migrants themselves benefit from these migration schemes. The potential is absolutely there, but if you leave it unregulated, then in many cases we'll end up with the lowest common denominator, and in many cases that means that migrants are being exploited for hard labor. And we do find in many cases that migrants do end up being doing the work that is difficult, dirty, and dangerous, and in many cases for a pittance in terms of economic remuneration. But it also points at the driving force behind migration. Why do migrants move? Why do people come to South Africa? Is it because of the political upheaval? Is it because of environmental developments, disasters, etc.? Yes, to a certain extent, but in 90% of the cases, it is for economy. It is to provide for the family, to look for a job, and to come up with a better future for the children. Economy, or rather the disparities in economy between the countries, is one of the main driving forces behind migration. And as such, I think the government of South Africa would do well to regulate this. If you don't regulate it, migrants will still continue to come, but the country won't have any control over who's coming into the country. By negotiating circular labor migration agreements, you have more of a grip over who comes into the country, but also more of a grip over what happens to the people that are in the country, and hopefully minimize the exploitation that we're seeing. The borderless continent, and I think it's perhaps not ambitious enough. Maybe we should talk about the borderless world. Ultimately, I think we all recognize that there's something called the Devil's Dictionary, and it defines a border as an imaginary line that separates the imaginary rights of the imaginary people from the imaginary rights of another imaginary people. Yes, borders are a construct, and borders are, in an ideal world, something that doesn't exist. But the reality is that it does exist, and the mere fact that we have these disparities in terms of economic opportunities between countries means that there's a driving force. People will continue to go to the areas or to the countries where the economic opportunities lie. Is it feasible at this point to eradicate all the borders? No, I don't think so. But is it something that we should work towards? Absolutely, yes. It's been done before. There's a number of areas around the world that have areas where you can freely travel between countries. And it's something that I think is high on the agenda of the SADC as well. So, you as the leaders of the future, I would expect you to continue to work for that and see to what extent the examples of ECOWAS or Schengen can be replicated in the SADC area as well. It's a bit unfortunate that it has taken the xenophobic attacks or the violence against migrants to put this agenda high on the agenda. But it is on the agenda, and I think and that in itself is a good thing, and we should work to capitalize on that to put border management or the need for border management on the discussion. The second question, xenophobic attacks, absolutely. Xenophobic attacks are a manifestation of xenophobia, and xenophobia in itself is a manifestation of frustration and of people not being happy with the presence of migrants. It's a scapegoatism, and they blame it on the migrants. Migrants are as I mentioned, the soft targets. To a certain extent, unknown makes unloved. People blame not their immediate neighbor. People blame the general group. People blame the people from the Horn of Africa, but not my immediate neighbor who happens to come from Ethiopia. And I think it's good to promote the dialogue between the host communities and the migrant communities in order to gain the appreciation of the contribution that both communities bring to each other. We've seen a lot of prejudices, a lot of things that people think about migrants. Migrants, they come to steal jobs. Migrants come with all kinds of diseases. Migrants come to steal our women. What is it? Migrants don't pay taxes. They're all criminals. They're criminal masterminds. They have all kinds of trade secrets that they're not willing to share with South African entrepreneurs. We've done quite a bit of research on what migrants actually, who the migrants are. It shows that migrants on average are younger. A typical migrant is around 20. In many cases, migrants are actually relatively well educated. They're relatively healthy, and it actually makes sense. If you're in bad health, then would you choose to leave behind everything you know and take a potentially very dangerous and long trip to South Africa in order to explore opportunities? I think you're far more likely to do so if you're healthy and relatively young. And then we see that migrants tend to be very entrepreneurial, which also I think is a character trait that serves migrants well. It also means that once they're in the country, they're about twice as likely to set up their own business and employ South Africans as South Africans themselves are. The rate of entrepreneurship among migrants is about 12%. Among South Africans, it is about 6%. A typical migrant entrepreneur employs up to 5 South Africans. So they actually contribute to job creation in South Africa. It is not something that is widely known or appreciated, and I think it's something that we should all work towards, this becoming more common knowledge, and so that migration is more appreciated as a phenomenon. And this is also something that we, as IOM, are working towards, rebranding migration. Migration is, in many cases, a force for the good, and it has brought mankind as a whole a lot of good things. And I think the appreciation for migration, or the lack of appreciation for migration, is something that underlies some of the xenophobic feelings that we've seen in the past. And then the traditional leadership. I think traditional leadership is very important because it has a strong possibility to bind communities together. A lot of people don't feel, they don't identify with the state, with South Africa, or with whichever country, and it's easier to identify with smaller groups. And this, I think, is where the potential for traditional leadership lies. But as I mentioned before, it should be binding through inclusion rather than binding through exclusion. And if that can be achieved, then I think we're a long way ahead towards a sustainable solution. Yeah.
Okay, Richard, thank you. We are left with basically 4 minutes, so we will just take 3, and please be straight to the point. Straight to the point. If you are lengthy, I will stop you. I will be very sorry to stop you. So I take the ladies and behind. Yeah.
Okay, for the purposes of time, I'm just going to make 1 point
Yeah.
as opposed to 2. I want us to also focus on the role that we as South Africans have also played in terms of the corruption that feeds into what then results into xenophobic attacks eventually, because I have family that's Mozambican, and I have family that will tell you that if you look at the journey of somebody coming into South Africa, they can buy their way into the border. Then they are getting into the country, and then they collude with Home Affairs officials to fraudulently obtain documents. And then they can go to the extent of signing up for social services, signing up for houses, signing up for all the benefits that are afforded to South African citizens currently. And then what happens is that South Africans then start getting agitated, and how do you get onto the same system that is supposed to be reserved either for documented refugees or for South Africans themselves. And so that also starts then becoming a point of contention and a boiling point. And so we do need to look at the role that we South Africans have also played. And then what that also does is put a spotlight, you know, on civil servants and the role of integrity and morality, that if you're not corrupt, it won't be easy for somebody to come and bribe you at the border post. If you're not, so there's also that element that us South Africans as well have also contributed. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 2.
My name is Nosiku Kalonga, and I'm actually from Africa. I say so because Kalonga is actually a name that we have a king, like in Malawi. So there's even Gao something Kalonga. But I was born in Zambia. My great-grandfathers were actually ancestors from Kalonga, from Malawi. My first name is Nosiku, and actually from which means we come from the western part of Zambia, and we are very related with the Tswana, the Ndebele's from Zimbabwe, the Tswana from Botswana, and the Sotho from South Africa. So when you ask me where are you coming from, I come from Africa. And the only issue that I found to be very eminent in the issue of xenophobic violence, or xenophobic as you call it, is the question that I had: how much do South Africa know about African history? How much? I was at the Center of Memory yesterday.
No, we have 1 minute remaining.
Okay, what seconds?
Please.
And I want to share a personal story. No, it's very related to xenophobic. My sister-in-law.
So will it be
died.
closing comment?
Yes. my sister, my brother. Now you're confusing me. But my the brother-in-law sister died during the struggle of South Africa. How did she die? The rebel, the Boers, the apartheid government were killing rebels in Zambia, and that daughter was on the father and the mother and the daughter was on the laps. They were driving in this car, and as they were shooting, they shot straight into the bullet of this girl. She was just 6 months old. So I asked the question: how much do South Africa know the history of Africa, and do they know how much Africa has contributed to what South Africa is today?
Thank you. We have to, sorry, we can't take 3 anymore because I've been asked to stop because the other program is already almost on the way.
Just a question.
Yes, please, straight to the point.
The question is, I would like to find out from the panel about the rate of convictions for those people that are engaged in xenophobic violence. Because that to me is a deterrence is not being shown. The leadership is not doing enough to send a word to others that they would not allow xenophobia to take place. And also the remarks by the immigration officers, the police officers, their tendencies are very bad. And it's backed by the South African Immigration Act, which is xenophobic itself. So I think you need to comment on those issues. Thank you.
My dear panel, please, 1 minute each.
Ladies first.
Okay, I'm not going to answer to each question.
Yeah.
The issues you raised, definitely of conviction, has been raised. I wanted to also touch what Ubaba said from Lead Africa. The issue of rural development is really crucial, and we have to ask who is driving the development agenda. South Africans don't know enough about our history, and it links with what Ubaba was saying, that we have to begin to question our curriculum. If you ask me, I'll tell you when Jan van Riebeeck came into South Africa. But if you ask me about the other history, I wouldn't know, so we need to undo that. But I think just in conclusion, I'd just like to really thank the organizers for bringing us here and enabling us to do this, and to say that for you as young people and young leaders, the ball is now in your court. You have to create the kind of South Africa that we are looking for. And if we begin to question and engage with some of these uncomfortable issues, we can begin to have a leadership image and take us to where we need to go. So our trust as the older generation, dare I say, is on you as the younger people to really begin to uncircle us, uncircle business of South Africa, uncircle government, uncircle traditional leadership, so that we engage with these difficult issues to become the kind of Africa that most of our fathers had fought for.
Okay, very briefly, less than a minute. On corruption, absolutely, corruption exists and corruption continues to exist, and it is a contributing factor. It is also something that we're concerned if the government were to decide to try to close its border, the only thing it will do is increase the fees of corruption at the border. It'll get more expensive to get into the country illegally. It'll line the pocket of the corrupt officials. So, not something we advocate for. African history, again, I would like to take it broader. World history. The world history, the history of mankind is a history of migration. And I think we would all do well to keep that in mind. Migration is something that has brought mankind a lot of advantages. And if we not try to stop migration, even if that were possible, I think we would not do ourselves a big favor. And then finally, the rate of conviction, I think we all know the answer to that. It's extremely low. If you commit crimes against foreigners, if you loot, if you burn, if you steal from foreigners, you're quite a bit less likely to be arrested and convicted than otherwise. And that, of course, is, I mean, part of it is the breakdown of rule of law. If you have violence in the street, if you have complete chaos in the streets, who can you arrest? Do law enforcement agencies have the capacity to arrest everybody? And I think the answer to that is clear that they don't.
Okay, on that note, I think, perhaps in closing, there is one word that I will say. The colleagues from Lead Africa, and this applies to all, you're talking of the curriculum, you are in this project, which is financed by USAID and the US. At the end of the program, you will definitely have a form to fill to give your opinion. If you feel that the program needs to be a bit more Afrocentric, tapping into indigenous knowledge, you can make the recommendation. That will give you, because through the program you have the chance to assess and at least say what you think and how we can shape it to suit African context, if it's really for African. On this note, I would like to thank you very much for your participation and attention. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much to the panel. You may now proceed directly to Kanya 1, 2, and 3 for the lightning talks, which will begin immediately. You may also just grab yourself a cup of coffee on your way there.